They say wars begin with explosions. But this one began with a man sitting behind a desk, reading reports that most of the country didn't want to believe. In the late 1930s, America was tired. Tired of Europe's problems, tired of foreign wars, tired of the memory of muddy trenches and folded flags from the last one. The popular mood was simple. Stay out, stay home, stay safe. Franklin Delano Roosevelt understood something uncomfortable. Safety was already slipping away. This is not the story of a general on a battlefield. It is the story of a president who prepared a nation for a war it did not yet want, but would soon have no choice but to fight. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Roosevelt did not address the nation with promises of victory or calls to arms. He spoke carefully, measured, almost cautious. Behind the scenes, the tone was different. Reports from U.S. diplomats in Berlin, London, and Paris described Europe unraveling at a speed no one had seen before. Britain was rearming in desperation. France was bracing for a war it feared it could not win, and Japan was expanding across Asia, tightening its grip on China and pushing deeper into the Pacific. Roosevelt read these reports late into the night, often dictating notes from his wheelchair, shaping questions for his advisors the next morning. The problem was not information. The problem was permission. The American public did not want another war. Congress reflected that mood. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s restricted arms sales and loans to nations at war, tying the president's hands at the very moment he believed time was running out. Roosevelt had learned patience the hard way. Polio had taken the use of his legs in 1921, forcing him to rebuild his public life inch by inch, speech by speech, step by step. That same patience now defined how he approached the world crisis. He did not try to drag the country forward. He tried to let the country walk there on its own. In radio addresses, later known as his fireside chats, he spoke not like a commander, but like a neighbor. He explained maps. He described oceans. He talked about distances, shipping lanes, and why events thousands of miles away could still matter to families sitting in living rooms in Ohio, Kansas, or California. War, he suggested gently, was no longer something that stayed overseas. By 1940, the map of Europe had changed beyond recognition. Poland was gone. Norway and Denmark had fallen. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Army escaped across the English Channel, leaving behind tanks, guns, and almost everything heavy it owned. For Roosevelt, this was the moment when preparation became urgency. He pushed for the first peacetime draft in American history. The Selective Training and Service Act passed in September 1940 by a narrow margin, registering millions of young men for military service, even though the country was not officially at war. At the same time, he accelerated defense production. Factories that once built refrigerators and cars began to receive contracts for aircraft engines, artillery shells, and ship components. The idea was simple but massive in scale. If war came, America would not scramble to build. It would already be building. One of Roosevelt's most controversial moves came in the form of a policy that sounded harmless but carried enormous consequences: Lend-Lease. In 1941, he proposed that the United States should supply weapons, food, fuel, and equipment to nations fighting the Axis powers, especially Britain and later the Soviet Union. Not as a sale. Not as a loan in the traditional sense, but as a matter of national security. He compared it to lending a neighbor a garden hose when their house was on fire. You don't argue about payment while the flames are spreading. You help first and sort out the details later. Congress argued. Isolationists protested. Newspapers debated, but the law passed. By the end of the war, the United States would send over $50 billion worth of supplies across the oceans, turning American industry into the backbone of the Allied war effort. Roosevelt was not blind to the risks. U.S. Navy ships began escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic, even before America officially entered the war. German U-boats stalked these supply lines, and several American vessels were damaged or sunk in what amounted to an undeclared naval conflict. Each incident brought the country closer to open war. Roosevelt never framed these moments as accidents. He framed them as warnings. In private meetings, he told advisors that the Atlantic was no longer a boundary. It was a highway, and someone hostile was already driving down it. Then, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the distance between preparation and reality vanished. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the United States was at war in the Pacific. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. What Roosevelt had spent years quietly preparing for had arrived all at once. Factories expanded overnight. Shipyards ran around the clock. Training camps filled with recruits who, months earlier, had been civilians listening to radio speeches about faraway places. The country did not have to invent a war machine. It only had to turn up the speed. Roosevelt would never see the war's end. By April 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin and American forces fought across the Pacific Islands, his health failed. He died in Warm Springs, Georgia, just weeks before victory in Europe. But the structure he built remained. An economy transformed into an arsenal. Alliances strengthened across oceans. A nation that had entered the conflict not as a victim of surprise, but as a power already in motion. This was not the story of a single decision. It was the story of years of quiet preparation, measured words, and calculated steps taken in a world that was already sliding toward fire. By 1942, Roosevelt no longer spoke about whether America would win. He spoke about how long it would take. The first months of the war were not a march forward. They were a retreat across oceans. In the Pacific, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, taking Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and vast stretches of island chains that had once been dots on American maps. In the Atlantic, U-boats prowled close to the U.S. coastline, sinking merchant ships within sight of beach towns and lighthouse beams. Roosevelt read casualty lists and shipping reports with the same quiet intensity he had once reserved for diplomatic cables. He marked losses in pencil, not ink. Numbers changed too fast for permanence. What mattered was trend, and the trend, slowly, began to turn. The heart of Roosevelt's strategy was not built in the White House. It was built in steel mills, shipyards, and assembly lines. By mid-1942, American factories were producing aircraft, tanks, and ships at a scale no nation had ever attempted. The numbers were almost abstract. Thousands of planes per month. Liberty ships launched in weeks instead of months. Entire cargo vessels assembled like mechanical puzzles and sent straight into the Atlantic. Roosevelt called the United States the arsenal of democracy. It was not a slogan. It was a logistical reality. British and Soviet officers toured American plants and returned home stunned by what they had seen. The war was no longer being decided only by generals and admirals. It was being decided by welders, riveters, machinists, and clerks tracking inventory on clipboards. Behind the public speeches, Roosevelt built a web of personal relationships that stretched across continents. With Winston Churchill, the connection was immediate and emotional. Their correspondence mixed strategy with humor, frustration, and moments of shared exhaustion. They called each other by nicknames. They argued about priorities, shipping routes, and where to strike first in Europe. With Joseph Stalin, the tone was colder, more cautious. Roosevelt believed that keeping the Soviet Union in the war was essential, no matter how uncomfortable the partnership felt. He authorized massive Lend-Lease shipments across the Arctic and through Persia, knowing many would be lost to weather, submarines, or sheer distance. Each convoy that reached Soviet ports meant another month the German army remained tied down in the east. Time, for Roosevelt, was the most valuable weapon of all. The war forced Roosevelt to make decisions that did not fit neatly into speeches or radio addresses. In 1942, he signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the relocation and internment of over 110,000 Japanese Americans. The policy was justified at the time as a military necessity. It would later be widely recognized as a violation of civil rights driven by fear rather than evidence. Roosevelt did not frame the decision publicly as a moral dilemma. He framed it as a security measure in a world that no longer allowed for clean choices. History would argue with that framing for decades. As Allied leaders met in places like Casablanca, Tehran, and later Yalta, Roosevelt's role shifted again. He was no longer just preparing for war. He was preparing for what came after. He spoke openly about a new international system that could prevent future conflicts. His vision included a global organization where major powers would, at least in theory, resolve disputes without armies. This idea would become the United Nations. Even in the middle of the largest war in human history, Roosevelt was already thinking about the shape of peace. Physically, the strain showed. The atmosphere was heavy with suspicion. Stalin wanted a second front in Western Europe, something to pull German divisions away from the Eastern Front, where Soviet armies were bleeding by the millions. Churchill favored continued operations in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt listened, mediated, and nudged the conversation toward a compromise. Out of those rooms came the firm commitment to a cross-channel invasion. D-Day was no longer an idea. It was a promise. Preparation for that promise consumed everything. American shipyards flooded the Atlantic with landing craft, cargo ships, and tank carriers. British ports filled with men and machines waiting for weather, tides, and secrecy to align. Deception operations created phantom armies and fake radio traffic, convincing German intelligence that the main invasion would strike far from Normandy. Roosevelt followed these plans from Washington, rarely appearing in the operational details, but deeply involved in the political framework that made them possible. War, at this stage, was as much about trust as tactics. At home, the country was unrecognizable from the one Roosevelt had inherited in 1933. Unemployment had vanished into uniform and factory shifts. Women entered industrial work on a massive scale, running lathes, welding hulls, and assembling engines. Ration books replaced open shelves. Gas, sugar, meat, and rubber became carefully tracked resources. Roosevelt spoke about sacrifice, but he also spoke about belonging. The war effort, he said, was something every citizen carried, whether they held a rifle or a ration card. As Allied armies pushed through Italy and prepared for France, Roosevelt's attention drifted forward in time. He pressed his advisors to draft plans for an international organization that would include not just the victors of this war, but the world at large. He wanted a structure strong enough to absorb conflict without turning it into catastrophe. Photographs from 1944 and early 1945 reveal a thinner, more fragile man than the confident figure from a decade earlier. His voice grew softer, his appearances shorter, but his influence did not fade. When Allied forces landed in Normandy, the supply chains, alliances, and strategic framework that made the invasion possible bore his fingerprints. From shipping priorities to diplomatic agreements, the war in Europe moved along tracks he had helped lay years before the first soldiers stepped onto French sand. Roosevelt once said that the presidency was preeminently a place of moral leadership. The war tested that idea in ways no previous president had faced. He led a nation into a global conflict, reshaped its economy, redefined its role in the world, and left behind institutions that would outlive him by generations, not through a single speech, but through thousands of decisions made in quiet rooms, late at night, with maps spread across tables and reports stacked in uneven piles. By 1943, the map on Roosevelt's wall no longer looked like a disaster in progress. It looked like a contest. In North Africa, Allied forces had pushed Axis armies into surrender. In the Pacific, American carriers began to claw back island by island, turning coral reefs and airstrips into stepping stones toward Japan. In the skies over Germany, bomber streams grew thicker, louder, and harder to stop. For Roosevelt, these were not victories. They were indicators. Each arrow moving forward meant shipping lanes holding, factories delivering, alliances staying intact. The war was becoming a system, and systems could be measured, adjusted, and reinforced. The conference in Tehran in late 1943 was the first time Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met face to face. 3 men, 3 empires, 1 war. The idea was ambitious. Some doubted it. He believed it mattered. Near the end of his long journey, he traveled far to meet others one last time. The long struggle around him was slowing. The noise of conflict began to fade, and the quiet work of mending and rebuilding started to take its place. The conversations turned to homes, to futures, and to how people might live once the hard days were over. The mood was no longer only about getting through another night. It was about picturing a better morning. He arrived looking worn. Faces searched for strength, but tiredness showed beneath the smiles. Even so, he spoke about sharing burdens, about treating one another with care, and about giving the next generation a chance to grow without fear. Not long after, his journey ended. The news traveled quickly. Work paused. Voices went silent. People heard it in distant places, under open skies, and in quiet rooms far from where it began. The man who had guided others through years of hardship did not live to see the calm that followed. But the hope he often spoke about was already beginning to take shape. That same year, people from many places began sitting together to talk instead of turning away. The bonds he encouraged shaped the days that followed. His legacy was not a place of struggle. It was a way forward.